Okay, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
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 So my game plan today is to essentially cover chapter 1, and then we'll start into chapter 2 and hopefully cover most of it on Monday. And then after we're done with chapters 1 and 2, we'll probably have a short quiz. And I don't know if that'll be Wednesday or Friday, but I'll let you know on Monday. But just so for your planning purposes, to think about our first quiz being on chapters 1 and 2. And it'll either be Wednesday or Friday. So over the weekend, if you can take a close look at both chapters and take a look at the Enron documentary that I've posted, and post your thoughts on that on the discussion board. We'll talk about that as well next week. Okay. So and then once we're done with chapters 1, we'll move on to chapters 3 and 4, and so this is essentially the approach that we'll be taking throughout the semester. We'll do a couple of chapters, and then we'll do a quiz. And as long as the quizzes are in line with expectations, then we'll just keep moving along. If I'm finding that there's some challenges in any of the chapters, we may slow down a little bit, but that's going to be our basic approach. Okay, so I'm going to start in on Kahoot today. So I'm going to flip between the slides in Kahoot as a means to review chapter 1. So I think you've all been exposed to Kahoot. If not, I'll spend a couple of minutes discussing how you go about connecting to it. It's very simple. I use it all the time, both in person and remotely. So I'm going to open it up now. Make some very irritating music in the background. It's the only thing I don't like about it. But if you've used Kahoot before, you just go in your web browser, put kahoot.it, or if you've downloaded the app, you can just open up the app and then you put in the game pin. And once you put in the game pin, if you can just put in your first name or your student ID, whatever you want. I use this as a review. It's not a quiz, or I don't keep track of your scores. So it looks like most of you are in. Samantha, do you need any help? Oh, there you are. Okay. So I think that's everybody that's on today. So let's get started. So if you haven't used it before, you'll have a chance to answer questions. So true or false? Yeah, so let me tell you why that's false. The evidence that you're going to find on any audit is going to vary, right? And so we need evidence to support our conclusions. So when we go into audit a particular entity, if we're doing a financial audit in particular, then we're going to look for evidence to support a conclusion. So the ideal conclusion when we do an audit is that we find that management has complied with generally accepted accounting principles and there's no material misstatement. So essentially that people can rely upon the financial statements as prepared by management. But the evidence we're going to collect is going to vary from organization to organization. And evidence is critical to being able to express an opinion. So when we talk about the process of auditing later in the semester, we'll see that, generally speaking, we can't examine everything. So we're going to have to come up with a methodology to determine what's important and then how much of that is we should be examining. And we're going to talk about, we're not going to really get into statistical sampling in great detail, but we're going to talk about the importance of using statistics as a basis to figure out how much of a particular area that we have to examine. The goal of auditing financial statements by the CPA is to do what? Yeah, so the goal is really to both indicate management has complied with GAAP and there are no material misstatements. There'll probably always be some misstatements, right? So when we talk about material, what we mean are things that are significant enough that they would influence the decision of a key stakeholder. And really, while there are many stakeholders with regard to financial statements, the key stakeholders for publicly traded companies for audited financial statements to go to the general public are really investors and creditors. So we want to make sure that audit, that we can walk away and say there was nothing that, there may have been some errors, but there's nothing that was significant enough that would change people's opinion about the financial statements as presented. And we also want to indicate whether management has complied with generally accepted accounting principles or not. So as we'll come to talk about the different types of audit opinions, the ideal is something called the unqualified opinion. And management has both complied with GAAP and there are no material misstatements. If there's some deviation to that, then there are steps below unqualified that we'll get to. But one thing that we don't provide is a clean bill of health because that's a subjective determination. There are companies that are making money that may have a rough road ahead in the future, and there are companies that are losing money that people are happy to invest in. So the blank has oversight and enforcement authority and establishes auditing and independence rules. Yeah, so all of these organizations play a role, but since the implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley, which happens around 2001 or 2002, and as a result of the Enron scandal, there was a board that was created called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. More frequently, it's discussed as an acronym, PCAOB, and they're actually given this authority. Now, does the Securities Exchange Commission and does the AICPA influence that committee? Yes, they do, because they have expertise, and the PCAOB will look to them for their opinions on changes or updates to generally accepted accounting principles and auditing standards. But at the end of the day, legally, this is the entity that has the legal authority to do these things. By the way, you should keep in mind that I use many of the Kahoot questions on the quiz. So sometimes I word them a little bit differently, but one of the bonuses of being here for this is that you'll get some insight as to what's going to be on the quiz and help to prepare you for the quiz. The PCAOB enforces auditing, quality control, and independent standards and rules. And if you don't know, that's fine. I mean, I'd like to know where people are on this. But this is not a quiz. This is a means that I use to review where people are. Okay, so I'm personally not overly concerned about how many people get things right or wrong. What I'm trying to use this for as a basis for you to really do a self-evaluation and then to have some discussion. Which enacted new regulations auditing financial report and legal compliance? Yeah, so that was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And many people consider that the most important financial law since the Securities Exchange Commission laws that were passed in the 1930s. And we'll examine Sarbanes-Oxley a little bit more as we go through the semester. But Sarbanes-Oxley really attempts to put a lot more control responsibility on management in terms of ensuring that financial fraud and irregularities do not occur. This is in Sarbanes-Oxley is often referred to as SOX, S-O-X. But it's a very important law that requires larger companies, in particular larger publicly traded companies, to have internal controls in place, document those internal controls, and then for the CPA industry to come in and attest that management has actually put these internal controls in place and then tested them. So it was a big step forward. It also did some other important things, which we'll talk about later. Auditors strive to maintain a high level of independence to keep the confidence of users. So, I mean, this question, I asked the question not so much because it's a difficult question, because naturally we would expect that this to be true, but you'll see when you watch the documentary on Enron, the smartest guys in the room, is that that broke down. And Enron is kind of the poster child, but there were a lot of not so significant problems with the CPA industry and big companies. At the time of Enron, I was working for a Fortune 50 company and was dealing with our audit firm, and I saw some of the pressures that auditors are under. They're under pressure to generate revenue, and one of the means of generating revenue was to do additional services, quote unquote, for companies and consulting services and so forth. And I can remember having conversations with partners of our audit company saying, and they would say, we're looking for additional opportunities to derive revenue if you have anything. And what that kind of creates is this environment of that they're going to kind of look the other way or be more flexible when the company is being more aggressive about managing earnings. And I saw some clear-cut examples of that where I worked. And so what happens with Enron is that that the independence of the CPA firm goes to a whole other level. That they're basically colluding, not just in bending the rules, but in breaking the rules. And so, but at the end of the day, what we have to recognize is that because CPA firms derive so much revenue from their clients, that there's a tendency to want to keep them happy. So what we'd like in the ideal is that the CPA firm is like the referee at the sporting event, right? And how frustrating would it be to all participants, right? If the referee, I shouldn't say to all participants, how frustrating would it be to a losing team if you knew that the referee was bending the rules in favor of the other team? And that's essentially what we expect of the CPAs, is to come in and be the referee, to call things as they are and to make sure that people are following the rules. And if they start to bend the rules in favor of management, then key stakeholders end up paying a big price. And so it's essential part of our whole economic system that the CPAs keep their independence. But it's not quite as simple as it appears because of the flow of money that comes into these entities. To perform an audit, there must be information in a verifiable form and some criteria by which the auditors can evaluate. Yeah, so, again, seems like a fairly straightforward question, which it is, but it's also something that, we have to keep in mind that, sometimes you're going to go in and you're going to find that the information is really either disorganized or not there. And so it's not enough to just rely on the. I'm sorry?
Could you tell me the pin again? It kicked me out.
Yeah, the pin is right here. It's 439-0591. So you can always see it on the screen. Okay.
I can't really see it because the thing.
Okay, yeah, it's 4. Okay, you want to write this down? 439-0591.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So the bottom line here is that we need to verify things, right? There's a saying that's been around for decades now: trust but verify, and that is certainly the case with CPA firms. We have to have tangible information to document that we've tested things, that we understand things. Many audit firms have gotten into trouble by relying upon management's assertions without doing an adequate testing. And so when we get into reviewing audit procedures, we'll look at what adequate testing needs to be done to be able to say that in a statistically valid way, I can assert that I checked inventory, I checked receivables, and so forth. So an auditor must be competent and have independent mental attitude. So again, this is a clear one, but I want to talk to you about what that means. Yeah, so when we talk about, we talked a little bit about independence, right? That we have to basically think of ourselves as the referee on the field, not as part of the, the management team. But to be competent also means that we have to continue to invest in our education. So every profession has a code of ethics, and almost every code of ethics is the obligation that we remain competent, that we stay up to date in terms of rules and regulations and techniques and procedures. And so it's really important that we do that. In auditing financial accounting data, the primary is concerned with determining what? Yeah. So the primary concern is to make sure that the information that management is responsible for and is presenting reflects what actually happened. So when we're not in the business of looking for fraud, and there's some debate within the profession about what the responsibility for the CPA firm is to find fraud. Fraud is very difficult to find because usually it involves collusion, and collusion is very hard to uncover. So, so the amount of responsibility that firms have to uncover fraud is not as high as it is to ensure that management's complied with GAAP and that there's no material misstatements, and as a result, the information reflects what actually happened. Auditors do not provide which of the following? Yeah, absolute assurance, right? So they provide the assurance that they can, right? And which is they followed generally accepted auditing standards, which includes doing the appropriate amount of statistical testing, and that they've have not uncovered any material misstatement. So if at a later point an auditor discovers that they missed something, then they have an obligation to work with management to restate the financial statements and to reissue the opinion. But there's no absolute assurance. It's just not possible. The audit report communicates the auditor's finding to users. I should have worded this a little bit differently. Yeah. So basically, when you think about an audit report, they have key stakeholders in mind. And the primary key stakeholders they have in mind are the investors and creditors. So the investors are the stockholders, they own the company. And creditors are people in organizations that loan money to an organization. They're the primary audience. And so the audit report is really there to give them assurance that there's been a third party who's competent and qualified to go in and review the transactions in a statistically valid manner and say that we didn't find any material misstatements, and management is complying with the rules that are generally accepted accounting principles. The 4 types of audit and attestation evidence includes all of these except one. Yeah, so when we think about what type of evidence do we need, right? Observations are critical. We can also, you know, not that we're going to rely upon exclusively, but we can use oral testimony of the management team and certainly documentary data about the transactions. But what we can't do is just rely upon management assertions without then verifying them. So if management tells me their inventory is a certain level and I don't do an adequate testing of it, then that's negligence. And if an ensuing problem occurs, then I'm probably going to have to pay a hefty penalty for that. So auditors focus on determining whether recorded information properly reflects the economic events that occurred. Okay, so again, we know the answer to this, right? That this is one of the key things that goes on in the audit profession. And what we're going to focus on later in the semester is how do we go about doing this? So now we know that that's one of our key objectives. And then, later in the audit course, we'll find out the process of doing that. And the why of why we do that is so that key stakeholders feel comfortable doing the things that are critical. One of the major things with audited financial statements is to ensure that the people with capital are comfortable providing it to the company. When you think about how does a company stay in business, how does a company acquire capital, there's really three major ways. One is that they can borrow it, and a lot of companies at the startup borrow money from whomever. It can be family and friends, or it can be banks or investors. So borrowing is one, and so they're key stakeholders. Another key stakeholder, people are willing to invest. Right? When a company goes public, or even before a company goes public, people invest their money. They become shareholders, owners of the operation, and they're key stakeholders. And the third is way to derive capital is to retain the earnings that the organization makes, but that often takes a long period of time. And so if we want to continue the capital flow in and out of a company, then people have to have confidence that the results they're looking at reasonably reflect the activities that occurred. And that was the big problem with Enron. Enron disrupted that whole confidence because we have checks and balances in place. When you think about the financial statements of big companies in particular, like Enron, the CPA is at the center of it, but there's other checks and balances in place too. And that's why people were scratching their heads saying, how could a major company like Enron defraud people for so long when there were so many eyes on it? So the other eyes on it include the Securities Exchange Commission. It also includes other regulators, but it also includes big investment companies like Fidelity and Chase Manhattan and so forth and so on. They don't just do things without looking beyond the basics. And so the question was, how did this happen? And so it's critical that that we recognize how important this is. So when we talk about the why of auditing, the why is to allow people to be able to rely upon that. And without it, really the whole financial system of any economy would suffer dramatically. So the role of the audit is to record, classify, and summarize economic events. Yeah, so this is really, if this said the role of the accountant, this would be true. So the auditor is there to review what the management has done with including the financial accounting personnel, and to make sure that, again, follow GAAP, no material misstatements. But the auditors do not create the financial statements. So one of the things that auditing has to do is not fix errors and not create financial statements, because they're there to review what management has done and what management owns. Most common way for you to obtain reliable information is to do what? Yeah, so internal audit does play an important role. And large organizations, many times, will have an internal audit staff, but and they certainly should add value in the whole assurance process, but they're not enough because they're still within the scope of management. So we really want somebody who's independent, in particular the CPA, who was trained, competent, and qualified to go in and do the right testing and to make the right assertions. And that really is the cornerstone at our being able to rely upon information, and I should say financial information in particular. External users of financial statements. Yeah, all right, good. Yeah, so it's all of these, right? So when you think about external users, we're going to primarily think about the investors and creditors. Of course, there are other external users, employees, even though they're not external, but trade unions, other government agencies, community members, all are all going to be, but the primary users are investors and creditors. And so all of these things play a key role. Audits provide absolute assurance about the financial statements. Right, so an audit goal is not to provide absolute, it's to provide reasonable assurance. Okay, so subtle, but it's an important difference, right? Because absolute means that I'm absolutely can guarantee, which we can't, right? Under no circumstances. So there are, when I say that management has complied with GAAP and there are no material misstatements, doesn't mean that there are no problems, and nor can I give you a guarantee that I haven't missed something. But what I should be able to guarantee you is that I've followed the accepted protocols in terms of how to do things. And if I've done that as an auditor, then I've done my job. Will sometimes mistakes happen? Absolutely. And if I find a mistake, then my job is to work with management to communicate that error. Assurance services can only be performed on financial data. Okay, yeah, so that's basically what we're looking at when it comes to, there are other ways of validating non-financial data, but that's not what we're going to focus on. Audits are not required for publicly traded companies in the United States. Okay, good. Yeah, so as I'm sure you know, publicly traded companies are required by the Securities and Exchange Commission to issue their financial statements 4 times a year, right? 3 quarterly and 1 annual. They can issue but the annual financial statement needs to be have an opinion from an audit firm, from a CPA, or else it has no value. Because if it hasn't been reviewed by a CPA firm, then essentially it's management's document without verification, and nobody is going to rely upon that, or nobody should rely upon that with any degree of confidence. Sarbanes-Oxley requires public companies to have external audit attest to their internal controls. Yeah, so it's not all publicly traded companies. I should make that clear. Originally, the thought was that all publicly traded companies would have to go through this process. But because of the amount of work involved in implementing Sarbanes-Oxley and having documented internal controls that have been tested by management and then reviewed by CPA firm, the regulators backed off a little bit. So the major publicly traded companies, probably the Fortune 500, maybe a little bit beyond that, they're required to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley and then have the CPA firm. They'll actually issue a second opinion, and the second opinion will be about compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley. So we'll find that in some larger companies, but not in all publicly traded companies. Public companies' audited financial statements are available on the SEC's EDGAR database. Yeah, so I'm sure you're all aware of this, right? That all publicly traded companies deposit their 10K or 10Qs in the Securities Exchange database, and it's available to anybody. So excuse me for 1 second. I have somebody at my door. I'll just be one. Sorry about that. One of the advantages and disadvantages of COVID era and working at home. All right, so let's go on to the next question. An auditor must have a thorough understanding of the entity and its environment. Yeah, again, a no-brainer in terms of questions, but important for us to understand that it's not enough just to look at individual transactions. We need to be able to put things in context, and a good auditor is going to understand the context in which the company performs and operates, and also the environment in which it finds itself. And every organization is going to be a little bit different. So. Auditors gather evidence to determine whether the statements contain any errors or other misstatements. Yeah, well, there's probably a little tricky question, and maybe the wording wasn't the best, but we're looking for significant errors or misstatements, not every error, not any error or misstatement. So that was probably my fault for the way I worded that. But the key idea here is that we're looking for significance. We're looking for things that are material, things that could influence somebody's decision. We couldn't possibly find every error or misstatement. Our goal is to prevent anything that would influence people's decisions from being misstated. The use of the certified public accounting title is regulated by whom? Yeah, it's done through it's a state-by-state process. So there is a uniform exam that's given across the country. There's 4 parts to it, and so I think many of you are interested in becoming CPAs, and if not, I would strongly encourage you to consider that, because if you think about the designation of the CPA, it's really the marquee designation for accounting in the accounting world. And it opens a lot of doors for people if you have that designation. So the way it works is that there's a educational requirement, which I think is in Massachusetts is 150 hours of accounting and auditing classes, and then you have to pass the 4 parts of the exam, and then there's a work component as well, which I believe is around 2 years of doing professional auditing work. So that's okay. All right. So the slides, I think we've covered the material in the slides. So we only have 5 minutes left, but I would encourage you to read through the slides. I'll look through them again. If there's anything that I want to discuss, we'll do it Monday. When we resume on Monday, we'll talk a little bit about, and I'd like to have a discussion about the Enron documentary. So please, make sure that you've reviewed it and posted your comments on discussion board over the weekend. And then if there's anything more to say about chapter 1, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll jump into chapter 2. All right. So thank you for being here today. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
You're on, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
My pleasure.